A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. Two developers I know both told me they built AI agents last week. One of them automated an entire invoice processing pipeline that handles 10,000 transactions a day without a single person looking at it. The other one built a high-end customer support chatbot for a luxury travel brand. They both call them agents. They both use the same buzzwords, but they are completely different species of software.
Herman Poppleberry here, and you are hitting on the exact identity crisis the industry is having right now. We are using one word, agent, to describe two fundamentally different architectural patterns. It is like using the word vehicle to describe both a self-driving long-haul freight truck and a high-end bicycle. Sure, they both move things from point A to point B, but the engineering requirements, the user interface, and the way you measure success are worlds apart.
It feels like we're in this weird middle ground where the marketing has outpaced the taxonomy. Today's prompt from Daniel is diving straight into this divergence. He is asking about the split between autonomous background workflow agents and conversational human-in-the-loop systems. We need to figure out if our current terminology is failing us, how this changes which models we actually pick, and which of the 50-plus platforms out there are actually built for which side of the fence.
This is such a timely prompt because the agent tooling market has absolutely exploded in the first quarter of 2026. We have seen over 50 platforms claiming to be the definitive agent builder, but if you look under the hood, they're optimizing for opposite ends of the spectrum. By the way, speaking of the tech powering things, today's episode is powered by Google Gemini 3 Flash. It is helping us navigate this messy landscape of autonomous versus conversational architectures.
So let's start with the definitions, because I think the confusion starts at the whiteboard. When we say autonomous workflow agent, what are we actually talking about versus the conversational ones?
The industry is starting to coalesce around a few terms, though it is still a bit of a wild west. The background ones are often called headless agents or event-driven agents. Think of these as invisible pipelines. They don't have a chat box. They are triggered by an event, like a new file hitting a server or a database entry changing. They ingest data, they reason through a series of steps, they might call a few tools, and then they output a result. It is a silent worker.
Right. And then on the flip side, you have the conversational agents, or what people are increasingly calling co-pilots or human-in-the-loop systems. These live in Slack, or a custom web UI, or even WhatsApp. They require that back-and-forth dialogue to refine a goal. If the agent isn't sure what you meant, it asks. If it needs an approval for a $5,000 purchase, it waits for a thumbs up.
And that distinction is everything. A workflow agent is judged on reliability and deterministic output. Did it process the invoice correctly without crashing? A conversational agent is judged on empathy, context retention, and steerability. Does it sound like a human? And does it remember what I told it 3 messages ago?
It seems like the biggest mistake teams make right now is trying to use a conversational architecture for a high-volume background task, or vice versa. If you build a background automation inside a chat-first framework, you are paying a massive latency and complexity tax for a user interface that no one is even looking at.
That is the core of it. When you have a human in the loop, the architecture has to prioritize state management and session persistence. You need to know exactly where the conversation stands. But in a headless workflow, you want high throughput and error recovery. If step 4 of your 10-step pipeline fails, you need a dead letter queue and a retry logic, not a chatbot saying, "Oops, something went wrong, can you try again?"
So let's get into the guts of this. If I am building a headless workflow agent versus a conversational one, does my choice of model actually change? Or do I just throw the smartest model at both and call it a day?
This is where the economics and the technical specs really diverge. For a headless workflow agent, you are usually looking for a very specific set of traits. You need high scores on function calling benchmarks. There is a great one called the Berkeley Function Calling Leaderboard that tracks this. You don't necessarily need the model to be a poet or a philosopher. You need it to be a world-class logic engine that can output perfectly formatted JSON 10,000 times in a row.
So you were saying I don't need the frontier model that can write a screenplay in the style of Hemingway just to categorize shipping manifests.
Well, not exactly, but you hit the nail on the head. For those headless tasks, developers are moving towards small language models or SLMs. Think about models like Claude 3.5 Haiku or GPT-4o Mini. As of April 2026, GPT-4o Mini is costing around 15 cents per million tokens. Compare that to a frontier model like GPT-4 or Claude 3 Opus, which can be $5 per million tokens or more. If you're processing 100,000 documents a day, that price gap is the difference between a profitable product and a massive money pit.
And the latency throughput trade-off is huge here too, right? If I am a human talking to a bot, I care about latency. I want a response in under 2 seconds or I think the thing is broken. But if I am a workflow agent running in the background, I might not care if a task takes 30 seconds as long as the system can handle 1,000 of those tasks simultaneously.
Spot on. Workflow agents are asynchronous. You can queue them up, you can batch them, you can run them on cheaper, slower hardware or lower priority API tiers. But conversational agents are real-time. High latency kills the user experience. So for the conversational side, you are often forced to use the frontier models, not just for the speed of the specialized versions, but because they handle ambiguity so much better. Humans are messy. We change our minds, we use sarcasm, we forget to give all the details. A frontier model like Claude 4.5 or the early access GPT-5 versions are much better at those vibe checks than a small, hyper-optimized logic model.
It is funny because we used to think more intelligence was always better. But in the workflow side, too much creativity is actually a bug. If I want a model to extract a date from a PDF, I don't want it to get creative or hallucinate a backstory for why the date is formatted that way. I want it to be a boring, reliable clerk.
That is a great way to put it. The clerk versus the consultant. The workflow agent is the clerk. It needs to follow the SOP, the standard operating procedure, to the letter. The conversational agent is the consultant. It needs to brainstorm with you, push back on your ideas, and synthesize complex, vague requests into something actionable.
I saw a case study recently from a logistics company that really illustrates this. They were using autonomous agents to process 50,000 shipping manifests every single day. They initially tried using a high-end frontier model because they thought they needed the reasoning power. Their bill was astronomical, and the agents were actually too wordy in their internal logs, which made debugging a nightmare.
What did they switch to?
They moved to a fine-tuned version of a much smaller model that was specifically trained on their manifest schemas. The cost dropped by 90%, and because the model was less prone to wandering off task, the accuracy actually went up. Meanwhile, on the other side of their business, they have a conversational agent for their high-value enterprise clients to track shipments. That one still uses the top-tier frontier models because it needs to handle angry customers and complex rerouting requests that involve 20 different variables and human emotions.
It is all about the context window too. A workflow agent usually processes one unit of work at a time. It doesn't need to remember what it did an hour ago, it just needs the current manifest and the tool definitions. But a conversational agent needs that long, deep context window. It has to remember that 3 messages ago, the user mentioned they were allergic to peanuts or that they need the delivery by Thursday. If the model loses that thread, the illusion of intelligence shatters immediately.
So we have these two different paths. One is about structured, high-volume reliability, and the other is about unstructured, high-reasoning interaction. But then we look at the SaaS market, and everyone is just selling an agent builder. If I am sitting there with a credit card ready to build one of these, how am I supposed to know which tool is actually right for my architecture?
This is where it gets really interesting because the tooling landscape has fragmented sharply over the last year. Let's look at the specialists first. If you are building those headless, event-driven pipelines, you are looking at platforms like N8N or Zapier Central. N8N in particular has been a powerhouse here. They processed over 2 billion workflow executions in 2025 alone. Their whole philosophy is about nodes and connections. You have a trigger, you have some AI reasoning logic, and you have an action. It is not a chat app, it is an automation factory.
And what about the other side? The chat first ones.
That is where you see players like Lindy or Intercom's Finn or Sierra. Lindy is a great example. It is designed to be your personal AI employee. You talk to it, you give it tasks in natural language, and it gives you updates. The primary interface is the dialogue. If you tried to use Lindy to process 10,000 background data entries from a database silently, you would be fighting the tool every step of the way because it is built for that back and forth interaction.
What about the ones that claim to do both? Daniel mentioned CrewAI and LangGraph. Those seem to be the big names that people argue about on Twitter every other day.
They are the heavy hitters for a reason, but they have very different DNA. LangGraph, which comes out of the LangChain ecosystem, is really the developer's choice for complex stateful workflows. It is architecturally built as a state machine. That makes it incredible for background agents that need to loop. Like, try this. If it fails, go to this state, try this other tool, and don't stop until the goal is reached. It can be used for chat, but its real power is in that non-linear background reasoning.
And CrewAI? I hear about people building whole teams of agents with that.
CrewAI is fascinating because it uses a manager-agent architecture. It is actually quite flexible. You can run it as a headless script where a manager agent coordinates 3 or 4 worker agents to write a report and email it to you. That is a workflow use case. But in their March 2026 release, they really leaned into human in-the-loop primitives. Now you can have a human act as the manager. The agents do their work, they pause, they ask the human for feedback, and then they continue. It is trying to be that bridge between the two worlds.
But there has to be a trade-off there. If a tool tries to be everything to everyone, it usually ends up being a bit clunky for the extreme use cases.
You see that with platforms like Relevance AI or Lindy trying to bridge the gap. Relevance is great for multi-agent teams that run in the background, but if you want a really slick consumer-facing chat experience, you might find the latency or the UI customization lacking. On the flip side, tools like Zapier are great for simple triggers, but if you need a deep, multi-turn conversation where the agent learns your preferences over time, it starts to feel very rigid.
It feels like the marketing problem is that agent is the sexier word. No one wants to say they are building a sophisticated cron job with a large language model attached to it, even if that is exactly what it is. They want to say they have an autonomous agentic workforce.
It is the AI washing of the automation space. We talked about this in a previous episode regarding vendor SDKs, where the language used to sell the product often obscures the actual technical implementation. If you call it an agent, you can charge a premium. If you call it a workflow, it sounds like something from 2010. But for the engineers listening, that distinction is the difference between a system that scales and one that falls apart.
I think about the failure modes a lot. If you pick a conversational tool for a workflow task, you end up with what I call the chat trap. You have these agents that are constantly trying to talk to each other or a non-existent human, generating thousands of tokens of conversational filler that you don't need. I saw one implementation where a company used a chat-based framework to sync 2 databases. The agents were literally saying things to each other like, "I have updated the record. Would you like me to do the next one?" "Yes, please proceed." They were paying for those tokens.
That is painful. That is a pure architectural mismatch. You don't need politeness in a database sync. You need a fast, silent function call. This is why the emergence of pedantic AI recently has been so important. It is a newer framework that focuses on being model agnostic and strictly typed. It allows you to build the logic of the agent first, and then you can swap the model depending on whether you are in a chat-heavy prototype phase or a production-grade background workflow. It treats the agent as a piece of software, not as a digital person.
So, if we are looking at the future here, do we actually need new words? Do we need to stop saying agent and start saying something else?
I think we need a taxonomy that reflects the trigger and the output. Daniel suggested event-driven versus prompt-driven, and I think that is a very strong way to look at it. An event-driven agent is a replacement for a script. It is a silent worker. A prompt-driven agent is a replacement for an assistant. It is a collaborator.
I like that. The worker versus the collaborator. It also changes how you think about safety and oversight. In a conversational, human-in-the-loop system, the safety is often baked into the interaction. The human sees what is happening and can hit the kill switch. But in a fully autonomous workflow, you need automated guardrails. You need another model, maybe an even smaller, faster one, acting as a supervisor to check the outputs of the first model before they hit the production database.
We are seeing that pattern a lot now. The multi-model supervisor pattern. You have your worker agent, which might be a GPT-4 Mini, doing the heavy lifting. Then you have a supervisor agent, maybe a specialized llama model or a Claude Haiku, that just looks for specific errors or security violations. It is much more like a traditional software testing pipeline than a conversation.
It also brings up the question of where the state lives. In a conversational agent, the state is the chat history. In a workflow agent, the state is the business logic. If I'm building a travel agent bot, the state is, where does the user want to go? But if I'm building a workflow agent that manages supply chain logistics, the state is which warehouses have stock and which trucks are available. Those are totally different engineering challenges.
And that is why the tooling is fragmenting. If you look at something like LangGraph, it is built to handle that complex business logic state. It is essentially a graph of nodes where each node can be a different model or a different tool. It is perfect for those supply chain issues. But if you just want a bot that can answer questions about your company's internal HR documents, LangGraph might be overkill. You might just need a simple RAG pipeline with a nice chat interface.
It is funny how we keep coming back to the same tension. The desire for a universal AI assistant that can do everything versus the reality that specialized tools are almost always better for specific jobs. I think we are going to see a lot of companies regret going all in on a single agent platform that claims to do both. They're going to find that their background automations are too expensive and their customer-facing bots are too robotic.
The hybrid architectures are where the real sophistication is happening now. Imagine a conversational agent that acts as the front end. It talks to the customer, understands their need, and then it triggers a headless workflow agent to actually go and do the work in the background. Once the work is done, the workflow agent reports back to the conversational agent, which then updates the human. That separation of concerns is classic software engineering, and it is finally coming to the AI space.
It is like a restaurant. The waiter is the conversational agent. They handle the nuance, the allergies, the grumpy customers. But the kitchen is the workflow agent. They don't need to be polite. They just need to execute the orders accurately and fast. You don't want the chef coming out to debate the menu with every customer, and you don't want the waiter trying to cook the souffle.
That is actually a great analogy, even if we are supposed to be avoiding them. But it really does illustrate the division of labor. The problem right now is that we are trying to hire one person to be the waiter and the chef at the same time, and we are giving them a single tool to do both.
So let's talk about the practical takeaways for someone listening who is about to start an agent project. What is the first thing they should do to avoid this architectural identity crisis?
The very first step is to classify the use case before you even look at a model or a platform. Ask yourself, is this system-driven or human-driven? If it is system-driven, if it is triggered by data and outputs data, you are building a workflow agent. You should be looking at N8N, Relevance AI, or a custom LangGraph implementation. You should be prioritizing cost per token and function calling reliability.
And if it is human-driven? If it lives in a chat box and needs to understand vague instructions?
Then you are building a conversational agent. Use the frontier models. Don't cheap out on the reasoning power because that is what makes the user feel like they are talking to something intelligent. Look at tools like Lindy or the conversational primitives in CrewAI, or even just a well-built custom UI on top of an assistant API. Prioritize context window and steerability.
My second takeaway would be about model selection. For those autonomous workflows, stop using the most expensive models by default. The small language model revolution in late 2025 and early 2026 has been incredible. You can get 99% of the performance of a frontier model on a structured task for a fraction of the cost. If your agent is just extracting data from emails, a massive frontier model is like using a Ferrari to deliver mail. It's cool, but it's a terrible business decision.
And the third one is about the agent label itself. When you are evaluating vendors, don't let them just say we build agents. Ask them specifically, how do you handle state for long-running workflows versus how do you handle real-time conversational latency? If they don't have a good answer for both, they are probably a specialist trying to pass as a generalist. Know which one you need before you buy into their ecosystem.
It is also worth thinking about the lock-in. We talked about this in episode 1649, the vendor SDK moat. If you build your entire agent logic inside a proprietary agent builder's specific language, it is going to be very hard to move that later if you realize you picked the wrong side of the divergence. This is why more teams are moving toward things like Pydantic AI or even just raw Python with structured outputs. Keep the logic separate from the orchestration.
That is the mature way to do it. We are moving out of the move, fast and break things phase of AI agents and into the production-grade engineering phase. The winners are going to be the ones who treat these as distinct architectural patterns rather than just throwing a prompt at a model and hoping for the best.
I think we're going to see a lot of these terms evolve. Maybe in a year we won't even say agent anymore. We might say autonomous pipelines and digital assistants as two completely separate categories in the corporate budget.
I hope so. Clarity in language leads to clarity in engineering. Right now, the fog of the word agent is causing a lot of wasted money and failed projects. But if you can see the split, you are already ahead of the curve.
It is a lot to digest, but it feels like the roadmap is getting clearer. Whether you are building the waiter or the chef, just make sure you aren't giving the chef a notepad and the waiter a frying pan.
Well said. This has been a deep one, and honestly, we could probably spend another hour talking about the security implications of this split, but we will save that for another time.
I think we have given people enough to chew on for one day. The divergence is real, the tools are specialized, and the choice you make at the start is going to haunt you or help you for the next 2 years.
Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the generation of this show.
If you are finding these deep dives useful, a quick review on your podcast app of choice really helps us reach more people who are trying to make sense of this AI explosion.
This has been My Weird Prompts. We are on Telegram if you want to get notified when new episodes like this one drop.
Catch you in the next one.
See ya.
This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash. Text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts, that's the close from sloth, from man, from long-eared host. My weird prompts, until next time, stay curious.